Amid the icy, bone-chilling rain, the officer stood coldly arresting the desperate mother, handcuffing her as she trembled in despair. Her heartbreaking cries echoed through the storm, calling out for the son she'd lost. But what he didn't know was that this moment would soon ignite a storm far more terrifying than his darkest nightmare. His most hidden, haunting secret was about to explode into the glaring light of justice, exposed to millions watching. What really happened to her missing boy was soon to be revealed, and this time, the guilty would have nowhere to hide from justice's relentless gaze. The late afternoon cast a pale golden hue over the park, the sunlight filtering through the gaunt trees, stretching fragile shadows across the rocky ground. The cheerful laughter of children echoed through the air, blending with the squeaks of rusted swings, the faded slide, and the old ball bouncing across the cracked earth. A group of kids chased each other across the ground, bare feet trampling the uneven patches of grass, their footsteps merging with the sweltering atmosphere of the late afternoon. Among them was a 5-year-old boy, his curly hair bouncing with every step, diligently dribbling the ball, his bright eyes glowing with innocent excitement. Each of his clumsy touches was full of effort, as if he believed that running just a little faster could touch the world itself. Kesha stood at a distance, leaning lightly against a weathered wooden bench, its paint peeling long ago. Her arms were crossed over her chest, fingers unconsciously tightening around the sleeves of her old denim jacket. A faint smile lingered on her lips, but the sadness that shimmered in her eyes was unmistakable. A gentle breeze swept by, carrying the scent of damp earth and a hint of grilled meat from a food stand across the street. But Kesha seemed oblivious. She remained focused on Jaden, her little boy, silently watching every awkward yet passionate movement he made. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing the edge of an old, creased photograph. Kesha didn't need to pull it out to know how the corners had worn over time, how the creases marred the face of the familiar figure within, a boy older than Jaden, with the same bright eyes, the same radiant smile. Jamal, her firstborn son, the child who should have been here, running, kicking the ball with his brother, their laughter mingling under the fading light. But no, Jamal was gone, and he would never return. The breeze suddenly picked up, rustling the tree branches, blowing yellowed leaves across the ground. Kesha shivered despite the lingering warmth of the day. She gripped the photograph tightly in her pocket, forcing herself to return to the present. Jamal was the past. Jaden was the present. He was still here, still alive, still growing each day. She had to cherish that. But no matter how many times she reminded herself, the hollow ache in her heart couldn't be shaken, a void that time would never fill. Suddenly, Jaden turned around, his wide eyes gleaming as he looked toward her. "Mom, do you see? Did I do it right?" he yelled, his breath coming in short gasps, full of excitement. Kesha swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing out a bigger smile, waving at him. "I saw, baby. You did great." Her voice was steady, but inside, an invisible pain pierced through. Jaden grinned, then turned back to the ball, blissfully unaware of the ghost lurking behind his mother. In the distance, amidst the bustling sounds of the park, a car horn blared unexpectedly, sharp and urgent. A flock of pigeons on a nearby rooftop suddenly flew off in a chaotic flurry, their wings beating the air, creating an unpleasant rustling sound. The city never really went quiet, not even in the simplest of moments. And though Kesha stood in the park in this very moment, she felt as though she was trapped between two worlds, a world where she was still whole and a world where she had lost a part of herself forever. She took a deep breath, letting the smell of earth, grass, and late summer fill her lungs, trying to anchor herself in the present. But as she exhaled, a strange feeling washed over her, a vague, unclear premonition strong enough to make her shiver. Today was just another ordinary afternoon, but was it really? A soft giggle echoed somewhere amidst the children playing, a sound so pure, so innocent, before it suddenly stopped. Kesha blinked, a cold shiver running down her spine as she realized that Jaden was no longer where he had been just moments ago. Her heart dropped. She had seen him only seconds earlier, a little boy with dirt-streaked legs joyfully kicking the ball across the playground. But now he was gone. She scanned the area frantically, her eyes darting around, heart pounding in her chest. She clenched her fists, the air around her suddenly feeling too thick, too suffocating. "Jaden." Her voice trembled, a whisper at first, but there was no response. The park, once so full of life, now felt eerily quiet to her. The creak of rusty swings singing in the breeze was the only sound that broke the stillness, along with the distant hum of traffic. But all of it seemed to fade as her panic deepened. The dust kicked up by the late afternoon wind was swirling in the air, and for a split second, Kesha felt as though the entire world had stopped moving. The smell of freshly cut grass and the faint scent of hot dogs from the nearby food cart hung in the air, but it was all distant, irrelevant to her now. She took a few steps forward, her heart thundering in her chest. "Jaden, where are you?" Her voice cracked with desperation, louder now, but the world around her seemed muffled. She called again, but this time the words felt foreign on her lips. The park, the children, the laughter, everything blurred into background noise as she frantically searched, her eyes wild and frantic. The feeling of dread in her stomach churned, tightening with each passing second. The overwhelming fear started to close in on her like an iron cage. Her feet moved faster, her body propelled by the sudden surge of adrenaline. But her eyes kept scanning the playground, the swings, the seesaw, the cracked asphalt, anywhere that might give her a glimpse of her son. "Jaden," she shouted again, her voice higher now, desperate, cracking under the strain. Tears were already threatening to well up, but she fought them back. She couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not with her son out there somewhere, lost. The park was full of families, parents sitting on benches, chatting with each other, but no one seemed to notice her distress. A few of the parents glanced at her, then turned away, uncomfortable or uninterested in her panic. Kesha swallowed hard, the dry lump in her throat making it almost impossible to speak, but she kept calling, "Jaden, please. Where are you?" Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, and her legs began to move faster, her shoes slapping against the dirt and grass. A heaviness clung to the air, as if it knew the fear was about to explode. She was too far from the playground entrance now, too deep in the park, too far from anyone who could help. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, the rapid click of boots against the concrete, followed by a sharp voice. "Be quiet." The words hit her like a slap. Kesha froze, her blood running cold at the sudden interruption. Her heart stuttered in her chest as she spun around quickly. There, standing behind her, were two uniformed police officers. One of them, tall and muscular with short blonde hair and dark sunglasses, was moving toward her. He seemed like he had been waiting for the right moment to approach, as if he had been following her all along. Kesha barely noticed the badge glinting on his chest, reflecting the golden hue of the fading sun, but she saw the name etched on it, Carl Evans. The man was closing in on her, his presence making her feel smaller and smaller with every step he took. His eyes were hidden behind the dark glasses, but the stern set of his jaw, the stiff way he moved, spoke volumes. "You're causing a public disturbance." His voice was cold and dismissive. "Stop right now." Kesha barely heard his words. Her eyes were still searching, darting to every corner of the playground, hoping, praying for a glimpse of her son. "My son," she cried louder now, a desperate edge creeping into her voice. "I can't find my son. Please, help me." Her words were coming faster now, her chest tightening with each syllable. But Carl just stood there, unmoved, as if her panic didn't even matter. His voice grew harder, sharper. "I told you to be quiet," he snapped, a hint of annoyance creeping into his tone. Kesha's head was spinning. She felt the world slipping away from her, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't leave. "Jaden, where are you?" she called again, this time louder, her voice rising in pitch, almost pleading. She took another step forward, but Carl's cold voice cut through the air. "I told you to stop." He stepped closer now, almost standing right in front of her, his presence looming over her like a shadow, suffocating. Ignoring him completely, Kesha took another step forward, her hand outstretched, her voice shaking with fear and urgency. "Jaden, please, where are you?" she called one last time. But before she could move any further, she felt a strong, rough grip on her arm. Someone yanked her back, spinning her around, and before she could even react, the force of it nearly knocked her off balance. She stumbled and nearly fell, but the officer held her tightly, his fingers digging into her arm. "Let go," Kesha screamed, struggling against the grip. "I need to find my son. Let me go." Her voice was full of panic, but Carl's expression remained unchanged, almost impassive. Instead, his voice dropped into a deeper tone, commanding and authoritative. "You're resisting an officer's orders," he said, his words icy, unyielding. Before Kesha could even comprehend what was happening, she was shoved hard. Her knees hit the ground first, Then her back slammed into the cold, unforgiving concrete beneath her. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her disoriented for a moment. She couldn't process the pain, the dizziness. It all blurred into a rush of horror. Dust rose from the ground, shimmering in the dimming light of the day. As Kesha lay sprawled on the concrete, her body bruised, her mind struggling to catch up. Then she felt the heavy weight of Carl's knee pressing down on her back, forcing her into the rough pavement. The cold, sharp click of metal echoed in the air as he slapped the handcuffs on her wrists, the tight grip sending a wave of burning pain through her arms. No, no. Kesha's voice trembled, high and frantic. She thrashed against him, her body fighting against the pressure, but it was no use. The handcuffs were too tight, too unyielding. "What are you doing?" she cried, panic-stricken, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I just need to find my son." Her voice broke with desperation, but Carl's grip only tightened. And then, a cry. It cut through the chaos like a knife, a clear, heart-wrenching cry. Kesha froze. It was Jaden. Her heart shattered as she turned her head, her eyes locking onto the small, terrified figure standing a few feet away. His eyes were wide, his face streaked with tears, his small body trembling uncontrollably. He was crying, sobbing in fear, unable to understand why his mother had been thrown to the ground, handcuffed like a criminal. "Mom!" Jaden's voice cracked as he reached for her, his little body trembling with each sob. But his hands, so small and helpless, were clenched into fists, unable to do anything but shake. He wanted to run to her, but the fear held him back. His entire world was shattering before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Kesha's heart broke in that moment, her chest tightening with pain as she saw her son helpless and scared. She forced herself to speak through the lump in her throat, her voice a choked whisper. "Please, don't do this in front of him," she pleaded, her words breaking. But Carl just sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "It's too late," he said coldly, the weight of his words crushing her. The people around her had stopped. Some were pulling out their phones, recording the scene. Their faces were a mixture of disbelief and fear, but no one stepped forward to help. No one moved. It was just Kesha, pinned to the rough concrete while her son sobbed, his cries full of terror, heartbreaking as he watched his mother, his protector, be treated like a criminal. The red light on the patrol car's ceiling flickered, its light reflecting through the window, dancing across Kesha's pale face. She sat slumped in the back seat, her wrists numb from the handcuffs cutting into her skin. Her knees still burned from the fall earlier, dust covering her jeans. But the pain that hurt the most wasn't the physical wounds. It was the last image she had seen before being dragged away. Jaden, small and terrified, tears streaming down his face as he cried out for her in vain. Each "mom" echoed in Kesha's heart like a knife, cutting so deeply she could hardly breathe. Carl Evans sat in the front seat, holding a radio, his tone indifferent, as though he had just arrested a truly dangerous criminal. "Suspect is a black woman causing a disturbance at the park. Bring her in for questioning." A short laugh came from the other officer. "Another failed mom. Can't even keep track of her kid and screams like a maniac." Kesha gritted her teeth, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream that she wasn't a bad mother, that she was just looking for her son, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But she knew no matter what she said, they wouldn't care. The car came to a stop in front of the police station. The door opened, and Carl grabbed her arm, dragging her out roughly as though she were an animal. A sharp pain shot through her shoulder as she was shoved forward. A few officers standing near the entrance sneered at her. She screamed loud enough to draw a crowd. "Just like them," one voice said, dripping with sarcasm and disgust. Kesha clenched her fists, but she knew that any resistance would only make things worse. She stayed silent, swallowing her fury, but her heart boiled as she heard the next words. "An irresponsible mother lets her kid run wild, and then cries like the world's ending." A female officer with blonde hair, her uniform perfectly pressed, stood with her arms crossed, looking at Kesha with contempt. No surprise. Their kids are always causing trouble. The words hit Kesha like a punch to the chest, stealing her breath for a moment. Irresponsible mother. 3 years ago, in a station just like this one, surrounded by people in uniforms with cold, indifferent eyes, they had said something similar about her. When she had entered the morgue to identify Jamal's body, when her son's lifeless body lay cold under the harsh white lights. when his face still held a hint of the terror from his final moments. When she screamed, they looked at her tiredly, coldly, and told her, "If you were a better mother, your son wouldn't have been shot." That scene flashed back in her mind like a film reel playing in fast forward. Jamal, 15 years old, wearing a dark jacket, arms raised to the sky, his eyes wide with panic as headlights shone directly in his face. "I don't have a weapon," his voice trembled with fear. But the gunshot rang out before anyone could react. A deafening bang. A body crumpling to the cold pavement, blood spreading across the sidewalk. The sound of footsteps running away. Someone's name screamed into the night. But Jamal never got up again. "Move it. We don't have all day to wait for you." Carl's voice broke through the memory. Kesha bit her lip, forcing herself to hold back the tremors in her body as she was pushed into the holding cell. The heavy clang of the metal door closing behind her echoed in the empty space. She sat down on the hard bench, her hands still cuffed behind her back. After a few moments, another officer entered, removing the cuffs, and then left her alone in the small, bare, suffocatingly silent room. She took a deep breath, her body shaking as she reached into her jacket pocket, feeling for the worn, faded photo. Her fingers brushed the frayed edges, and she gently pulled it out, running her fingers over the surface. Her gaze softened, but there was pain in her eyes as she looked at the familiar face. Jamal's smile in the photo was full of life, a child unaware of how cruel the world could be. Kesha closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the photo, her voice a whisper, barely audible but filled with all the pain and resolve burning in her chest. "I won't let this happen again." At the first trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating. The air felt thick with the smell of old wood and crumpled papers, mixing with the sterile chill of the harsh white lights that cast long, unforgiving shadows across the faces of the jury. Kesha sat silently at the defendant's table, her hands resting on her lap, fingers tightly clenched as though holding on to the last shred of control. Her back was straight, but her posture wasn't stiff. It was the stillness of a woman who had long since learned to endure, to brace for the inevitable. She did not move. She did not flinch. But her eyes, those cold, razor-sharp eyes, never once left the man standing at the witness stand, Carl Evans. The very man who had taken everything from her, who had dragged her name through the mud and shamed her before the world. He was there, towering over her with his smug confidence. A man who believed the stage was his, who had rehearsed this moment over and over in his mind until he was convinced of his own righteousness. He stood with his chest puffed out, his shoulders squared, as if he were some kind of hero, the picture of self-assuredness. As he cleared his throat, his eyes briefly scanned the jury like a predator eyeing his prey. Then he began his testimony, his voice smooth, calculated, laced with venom, as he painted her as the villain. The defendant caused a public disturbance by screaming, resisting, and creating chaos in the park, Carl declared, his voice dripping with disdain. When I asked her to calm down, she became aggressive and violent, attacking me without provocation. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air before adding with a dramatic flair, "I had no choice but to subdue her in order to protect the public." Kesha didn't flinch. Not even a muscle moved. But inside, a storm was rising, a storm of rage, of disgust, of a burning desire to tear down the lies that he was weaving so carefully. She could feel the whispers of agreement coming from the jury, the few who had already decided her guilt. The prosecutor, a slick, middle-aged man with an arrogant smirk on his face, leaned forward, the gleam of his smile as cold as Carl's. "How terrifying," he remarked, his voice full of mockery. A woman in the park screaming like a mad woman, a hysterical mess, and then she attacks a police officer? Absolutely unacceptable behavior from anyone, but especially from a mother. The words were like daggers, sharp and precise, designed to cut deep. A few snickers rippled through the room, the kind of laughter that mocked her, dismissed her pain, and reduced her to nothing more than an object of ridicule. The kind of laughter that said she didn't matter, that her voice didn't matter, that her struggle didn't matter. Kesha didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence in her was deafening. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to defend herself against the lies. She didn't need to justify the burning fury inside her heart. She simply sat there, her gaze locked on Carl, and the world seemed to slow. She was a stone, cold and unmoving. But underneath the surface, there was a fire, an inferno of anger that Carl could not yet see. Her eyes were narrowed, cold as steel, and yet full of the kind of intensity that made even Carl hesitate just for a brief moment. His gaze faltered as her eyes burned into him. He could feel the weight of it, the quiet intensity of a woman who had been broken only to become something much stronger. He had thought her a weak, hysterical woman, a simple emotional wreck. He thought she would crumble under the pressure, break down under his accusations. But the look she gave him was not that of a woman on the edge of defeat. It was the look of a woman who had been pushed to the edge and had chosen to stand tall. The look of a woman who had lived through too much to let someone like him win. Carl gripped the edge of the stand harder, his knuckles turning white. For the briefest second, he faltered, as though something in her stare had pierced through his carefully constructed facade. But he quickly regained his composure, pushing away the unease that threatened to take root. He had to finish this. He had to keep up the lie because if he didn't, the truth would destroy him. And Carl Evans was not the kind of man who lost. But Kesha wasn't done, not by a long shot. Her voice was calm when it finally came, a low whisper that could have shattered glass if spoken with more force. "You can lie all you want," she said, her words dripping with venom, "but you will never bury the truth." The courtroom grew still. The weight of her words pressed down on everyone in the room, a suffocating silence falling over them. Carl blinked, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand the depth of the challenge that had just been laid at his feet. He opened his mouth to respond, but his words caught in his throat. Kesha leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "You can call me whatever you want, Carl," she continued, her voice still a quiet fury. "But remember this. I know what you did, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The words echoed in the courtroom, leaving Carl standing frozen. The storm that had been brewing in Kesha's heart had finally broken free, and Carl knew, in that moment, that he had underestimated her. This wasn't a woman about to back down. This was a woman who would make him face the truth, no matter how hard it was for him to hear. A sharp pain gripped Kesha's chest, squeezing the air from her lungs as she heard the faint sound of sobbing from the row behind her. Jaden. The little boy was trying to stifle his cries, but fear erupted in small, guttural sobs, breaking through the heavy silence of the courtroom. He was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he was old enough to know that his mother was being humiliated in front of everyone. Kesha couldn't bring herself to turn around, unable to look into her son's tear-soaked eyes. She feared that if she did, the fragile calm she had built up would shatter, and she would lose herself completely. In front of her, her attorney, a young man, nervous and lacking confidence, was attempting to argue her case. "Your Honor, my client had no intention of causing a disturbance or resisting the police. She was simply a mother who became frantic when she couldn't find her son in the park. Her shouting was a natural response any mother would have." "Oh, of course," the prosecutor interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "A natural response from a careless mother who can't even keep track of her child, then screams like a lunatic in the streets when things go wrong?" He smirked, crossing his arms, stepping toward the jury box as though delivering a performance. And when the police, who were there to maintain order, intervened, not only did she refuse to cooperate, but she physically attacked an officer on duty. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the normal behavior of a model citizen." Laughter erupted from the crowd. A few whispered remarks, snickers, and murmurs of approval floated through the courtroom. One woman in the back row shook her head and sneered. Another welfare mom who thinks she can shout and cause chaos everywhere she goes. A middle-aged man leaned over to whisper to the person beside him, but his voice was loud enough for Kesha to hear. "They're always like this. Always the victim, always wronged. Pathetic." The words hit her like a slap, but it wasn't shame she felt. It was fury. A heat began to burn through her veins, but still, she stayed silent. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. She was done being their punching bag. Her lawyer cleared his throat, trying to push through the attention. "The prosecutor is attempting to distort the truth. My client has no criminal record, no history of violence. Furthermore, there is no concrete evidence to suggest she attacked the officer." The prosecutor burst into a mocking laugh. "No evidence." He turned to Carl Evans, still standing confidently at the witness stand. "Officer Evans, please remind the court, how did the defendant react when you asked her to calm down?" Carl didn't hesitate. "She screamed in my face, flailing her arms, shoving me like a wild animal, out of control." He paused for dramatic effect, then added the final insult. "She looked like she was on a rampage." eyes bloodshot, mouth frothing, like some kind of addict. The room erupted into whispers. A few people chuckled. Others shook their heads in disgust. How disgraceful! A woman's voice rang out, loud and pointed. A woman like that dares to call herself a mother? Jaden's cries grew louder, his tiny body shaking with fear in the row behind her. Kesha's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging so deep into her palms that she could feel the sting of the pressure, almost drawing blood. She didn't speak, but her eyes shot daggers at Carl. It was a look so sharp, so seething with anger, that Carl couldn't ignore it. He froze, his hand still gripping the edge of the witness stand, his confidence faltering for a brief moment. Kesha didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't resist. She simply sat there, her silence louder than any shout. The cold, sharp gaze she locked onto Carl was a storm contained, a warning of something far worse brewing beneath the surface. He could feel the weight of it, a growing tension that threatened to snap at any moment. In that moment, Kesha was not just the woman they were trying to tear apart. She was the woman who had already survived the worst, and she would not be crushed. The courtroom fell into a brief silence as the judge turned to Kesha, his gaze holding a touch of patience but not a hint of warmth, just the cold indifference of authority. Defendant, do you wish to represent yourself? Do you have anything to say about the charges against you? Kesha lifted her head slowly, her eyes dark and filled with an unreadable light. There was no anger, no pleading, only a terrifying calm. She didn't need to explain herself in long speeches. She didn't need to argue with those who had already made up their minds about her guilt. She simply spoke, slowly and clearly. I didn't cause any disturbance. I was just looking for my son. The tension in the room thickened as all eyes turned to Carl Evans. Her words cut through the atmosphere like a sharp blade, slicing through the layers of contempt and lies that had filled the room. Don't you remember me, Carl? Carl froze for just a moment. In that brief second, his lips stiffened, his gaze faltering. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, his composure was back, his cold indifference firmly in place. He shrugged, acting like he couldn't care less. I don't know who you are. His voice was curt, but something in the way he avoided her gaze made the room feel unervingly quiet. The prosecutor broke the silence with a scoff. The defendant is trying to distract with meaningless questions. Is she trying to turn this trial into some kind of drama? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of person we are dealing with. Those who never take responsibility for their actions, always looking to blame others. The jury exchanged glances, a few furrowing their brows, but no one spoke up. Kesha sat motionless, but her eyes had changed. They were no longer cold. They were sharp, holding a mysterious glint, as though she knew far more than anyone realized. The judge sighed, tapping his gavel lightly. Defendant, if you have nothing else to say about your case, I suggest we move on. Kesha shifted her gaze from Carl and looked directly at the judge. Her voice was quiet but firm and resolute. I didn't cause any disturbance. I was just looking for my son. No justification, no lengthy explanation, just a simple sentence that caused the entire courtroom to fall into an eerie silence. A few people sneered, shaking their heads, but somewhere in the room, there were eyes that looked momentarily confused, as if they had just realized that something was being left unsaid. Carl glanced at Kesha one last time before stepping down from the witness stand. He didn't say anything, but his hand clenched into a fist, as though some memory was surfacing from the depths of his mind, a memory he didn't want to face or didn't dare to confront. The atmosphere in the courtroom was taut, like a string about to snap. Kesha sat there, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging deep into her palms. Her breath came heavily, her eyes darkening as she watched Carl Evans step down from the witness stand, his face still wearing that arrogant mask, as though he didn't care about anything that had transpired. The mocking laughter, the whispered insults, all continued to ring in the air, each word a sharp blade cutting at her pride, at her very soul. And then she stood up. Enough! Her voice rang out, no longer trembling, no longer choked with emotion. It exploded like a tempest, overwhelming the room. Every eye in the courtroom snapped to her. She didn't care anymore. She couldn't stay silent for another second. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was strong, reverberating through the courtroom. I am Kesha Williams, she cried out, her body shaking with the fury that had been building inside her for far too long. I am the mother of Jamal Williams, the boy that you shot dead 3 years ago. The room seemed to shatter. Carl froze, his face draining of color, as if he had just been punched in the gut. The air in the courtroom shifted suddenly. Murmurs rose like a tidal wave, whispers spreading among the crowd. Some people gasped, Others turned to each other, their voices barely audible as they exchanged stunned looks. The jury glanced at each other in confusion, some even taking a small step back, as if they had just witnessed something too immense to comprehend immediately. Order! The judge slammed his gavel on the desk, his voice fighting to be heard amid the chaos. Order in the courtroom immediately. But the words barely reached anyone. Carl opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His lips trembled, his eyes flickering as if he was searching for a way to deny the truth. But his body betrayed him. His hands were shaking, sweat beading on his forehead. Kesha's mind flashed back to that night 3 years ago. The cold night air, a dark alley, the flickering street lights casting long shadows on the rain-slicked pavement. Jamal, just 15 years old, stood beneath a sickly yellow light, holding a toy gun he had just bought from the corner store. A half-smile lingered on his young face, unaware of the nightmare approaching him from the shadows. The sound of footsteps, rapid, heavy, echoed on the wet ground. "Stop! Put your hands up now." Jamal spun around, eyes wide, the blinding flashlight shining straight into his face. A tall figure stood at the alley's entrance, a gun raised, breathing heavy. "I don't have a weapon," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He raised both hands, the toy gun slipping from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the ground with a soft clink. But Carl Evans didn't see a child. He didn't see an innocent teenager trembling in the darkness. He only saw a threat, a gun, a split-second decision. Bang! The shot rang out, echoing through the dark alley. Jamal's body jerked, then collapsed onto the cold pavement. His eyes widened in terror, his hand reaching out desperately, grasping for the life that was slipping away from him. Warm blood spread across the ground, mixing with the puddles of rainwater. Carl stepped closer, his eyes glancing at the toy gun lying lifeless on the ground. Half of the handle was stained with blood, and in that moment, he knew he had made a mistake. But he didn't say anything. No apologies. No remorse. Just twisted reports. Just a truth buried under lies. Back in the present, Kesha stood in the middle of the courtroom, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. She stared at Carl, seeing the terror in his eyes. No more arrogance. No more contemptuous smile. Now he remembered, and he knew, this time, Kesha would not let him escape. The courtroom erupted after Kesha's accusation. The murmur of voices, the angry shouts rose from the audience. Faces wide with shock and eyes that turned to Carl Evans, all focused on him. He stood there, rigid, as though slapped in the face before an audience. For a moment, he opened his mouth, unable to find any words. Then, like a drowning man grasping at a lifeline, he shook his head frantically, his voice stammering, panicked. "She's crazy. I never. It was an accident. An accident. I followed protocol." His voice rose, desperate for agreement from the judge, from the prosecutor, from anyone in the courtroom. But the only response he received was the rising swell of angry murmurs, spreading like a tidal wave. The prosecutor quickly jumped in, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to distort the truth. The defendant is trying to derail this case with a fabricated story." But this time, the spectators couldn't hold back. A middle-aged man stood up, his face filled with fury. "A story with no evidence? That boy's dead right here in our alley, and you're calling it an accident?" A woman screamed. "Another cop killing, and no one dares to touch him." The judge slammed the gavel, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. "Order! Order in the courtroom immediately." But the room was beyond control. Then, a voice cut through the noise. "Mom." Kesha turned quickly, her heart breaking as she saw Jaden rushing from the back row. The small boy ran straight to her, his eyes filled with tears. Did you say he killed Jamal?" Jaden's voice trembled, each word stuck in his throat. Kesha dropped to her knees, pulling her son tightly into her arms. She stroked his hair, trying to comfort him, but her heart ached so much she couldn't speak. Jaden clung to her, his small body shaking. Why? Why did he do that? Above them, the judge inhaled deeply, struggling to regain order. "I will request to review the previous records on this case," he said, his voice lowering, more serious than ever. But immediately, the prosecutor interjected, this time with calm, yet cold words. "That case is closed. No one was prosecuted." The courtroom seemed to freeze in that instant. The words echoed, bringing with them a suffocating weight, making the air heavy and oppressive. Kesha closed her eyes, then smiled, a bitter smile that sent shivers down the spines of those closest to her. Of course, she whispered, opening her eyes to look directly at Carl Evans. Because he's a cop. And my son. He was just a black child. The prosecutor didn't respond. No one responded. There was no need to say anything more because the truth had never been clearer. Carl stood there, his teeth clenched so tightly his jaw trembled. The smugness was gone. The arrogant smile had vanished. What remained was the panic clearly showing in his eyes as he slowly began to back away, as though he wanted to escape the room as quickly as possible. When he turned to leave, his movements were stiff, hurried. But Kesha didn't take her eyes off him. She bent down, gently holding Jaden close, running her fingers through his soft hair. "Mom won't let this end here," she whispered, her voice low, firm, but carrying a promise that could never be broken. "This is just the beginning." Carl Evans sat in his superior's office, his teeth clenched so hard it was as if they would crack. His face twitched with rage. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had once controlled everything, but now a woman like Kesha Williams threatened it all. "We need to handle her before this spirals out of control," he said, his voice low and thick, trying to hide his anxiety. The man behind the desk, a senior officer with cold, sharp eyes, crossed his arms, thinking for a moment before slowly nodding. "We can't let this spread. She needs to be destroyed before she has the chance to speak." Just a day later, a headline appeared on the front page of a tabloid, screaming in bold letters, "Grieving mother or mad woman. Woman seeks revenge against the police." The dense paragraphs beneath were filled with fabricated details, claims that Kesha had a history of unstable mental health, that she had become so obsessed with the old case she'd lost control, that she had threatened an innocent police officer just out of blind vengeance. On social media, the article spread like wildfire. Hundreds of comments flooded in, some supporting her, but most filled with insults, mockery, and hate. Kesha read the article, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She wasn't surprised. She knew Carl wouldn't sit idly by while his grip on everything slipped away. But she was ready. Later that afternoon, Kesha met Tina Marshall, a freelance journalist, in a small cafe tucked away on a quiet corner. Tina looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Are you sure about this? If I publish this, I won't be able to take it back." Kesha didn't hesitate. She slid a thick folder across the table to Tina. "This is everything I've gathered over the past 3 years. They've buried it all, but I won't let it stay in the dark." Tina flipped through the pages, her eyes widening when she reached a particular document, a recorded audio clip. Kesha crossed her arms, her gaze cold. "Listen to it." Tina plugged in her headphones, connected to her phone, and hit play. A gravelly voice echoed from the speakers, distorted but unmistakable. "Carl Evans. It was a mistake. I thought he had a gun. I didn't know. I just reacted. But the boss said he'd take care of it. No one needs to know he was just a kid." Tina pulled the headphones off, her face in shock as she looked up at Kesha. She inhaled deeply, then slowly exhaled. This could destroy him." Kesha nodded, her voice resolute. "Then use it." That night, Kesha's apartment was dark, with only the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. She sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the wooden box at her feet. She opened the lid, revealing a cold gun nestled among old papers. Her fingers lightly traced the barrel, the familiar yet foreign sensation crawling under her skin. She could end it all with a single shot. One bullet could make Carl vanish forever, but she didn't. Kesha slowly closed the box, sliding it beneath her bed. She wouldn't let them make her the person they were trying to portray, a woman driven insane, willing to kill for revenge. She didn't need a gun. She had the truth, and she would let the truth burn Carl Evans to the ground. The sound of glass shattering rang out in the dead of night, making Kesha jump. Jaden's panicked scream echoed from the room next door. She rushed out of bed just in time to see the window completely shattered. A brick had been thrown through, a small piece of paper attached to it, scribbled with a warning, "Shut up or else." Jaden clung to her, trembling with fear. Kesha held him tightly, her eyes darkening, but this time she didn't cry. She didn't tremble. They thought they could scare her. They thought they could make her back down. They were wrong. She leaned down, whispering into Jaden's ear, her voice stronger than ever before. "They can't make mommy scared anymore." The next morning, as Kesha was cleaning up the broken glass on the floor, her phone buzzed. It was Tina. Kesha answered. Tina's voice was urgent but filled with resolve. "I'm going to publish it. The whole story, including the recording." Kesha closed her eyes, letting out a slow breath. Finally, light began to pierce through the thick darkness. This wasn't the end, But at least this was the beginning of a real fight. The news exploded like wildfire, spreading throughout the city. Tina's article was everywhere, on every headline, flooding social media, sparking an unprecedented wave of outrage. The words on the front page were an undeniable indictment. The truth about Jamal Williams' death. Was the officer who shot the boy really innocent? Thousands of people poured into the streets, gathering outside the police station, holding up signs with heart-wrenching messages. Justice for Jamal, and no more deaths. The chants echoed down the streets, shaking the very walls of power that had hidden the truth for so long. In his office, Carl Evans slammed his phone down on the desk, his eyes bloodshot with both fury and fear. He had been suspended immediately, but that didn't ease the burning rage inside him. "I'm not going to let her win," he snarled, punching the wall so hard his hand throbbed with pain. He had once thought himself invincible, that someone like Kesha could never touch him. But now, the entire city was turning against him. The day of the trial's reopening, the courtroom was packed. The spectators' faces were filled with anger, their eyes full of anticipation for justice. Kesha sat at the witness stand, her hands resting lightly on her trembling palms, not from fear, but because she knew how important this moment was. She took a deep breath, then began. 3 years ago, on a cold night, my son, Jamal Williams, never came home. Her voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of an unimaginable pain. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a boy. A boy who was shot dead by the police in a dark alley just because they thought he had a weapon. She closed her eyes for a moment, memories rushing back. Jamal, his eyes wide with fear, his small hands raised, his voice trembling. "I don't have a weapon." But the gunshot rang out before anyone could listen. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence. Some bowed their heads, others quietly wiped away tears. But then, unexpectedly, the courtroom door swung open. A man stepped in. His police uniform had long been discarded, but his posture still carried the authority of someone who had once stood in the ranks. He walked directly to the witness stand, scanning the room before stopping in front of Carl, whose face was now painted with shock. "I'm Mark Reynolds, former police officer." His voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "I worked with the defendant, and I have the truth to tell." The prosecutor quickly glanced at the judge, then nodded. "Please proceed." Mark took a deep breath, his gaze now fixed on Carl, his voice cold. "He didn't just shoot Jamal. He bragged about it. He said, 'Those black kids need to be taught a lesson. The only way to make them fear is to let them taste the gun.'" The atmosphere in the courtroom exploded. Some people screamed in outrage. Others burst into tears. Kesha bit her lip, tears falling down her cheeks, but her eyes never left Carl. Carl, once so smug, so proud, was now shaking. He turned away, but he couldn't escape the burning stares aimed at him. "I didn't mean to," Carl screamed, his face contorted with panic. "I didn't mean to shoot him, but I don't regret it." The words triggered an eruption in the room. Shouts of anger rang out from every direction. The jury exchanged looks, their faces now resolute, no longer hesitant. The judge slammed his gavel down with a force that reverberated throughout the room. "Based on the evidence and witness testimony, the court finds defendant Carl Evans guilty." Carl collapsed, his hands gripping the table in front of him, his face ashen. He tried to say something, but no one was listening. No one cared anymore. Kesha closed her eyes, tears silently streaming down her face. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast, but inside Kesha's heart, she knew that for the first time in 3 years, she could breathe without the crushing weight of grief. She stood on the courthouse steps amidst a crowd cheering for justice, holding tightly to a photo of Jamal. She gazed at her son's face, his bright eyes, his radiant smile, the one she had always remembered. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it was not a tear of despair. She whispered softly, her voice like a passing breeze, "Rest in peace, Jamal." A year after the trial, Kesha's world no longer revolved around hatred and grief. She had turned her loss into something more meaningful, a beacon of hope for other children who might otherwise have walked the same path that Jamal had been pushed onto. Jamal's Hope, a charity organization, was born, dedicated to helping underprivileged children with access to education, a way to escape violence, and the opportunity to build a brighter future. On the opening day of the charity, Kesha stood before dozens of people in a small but warm hall where excited children eagerly received their first books and school supplies. She looked at Jaden, now older, his eyes full of pride as he held his mother's hand. "Mom, Jaden said quietly. I'm proud of you. Kesha smiled, for the first time in years, a real smile. The community did not forget Jamal. They decided to name a small park in the neighborhood after him, Jamal Williams Park. On the opening day, hundreds of people came to attend, bringing flowers and sharing stories of the boy with the radiant smile they had once known. Kesha stood before the small statue of Jamal placed in the center of the park, her eyes welling up with tears. Her son was no longer there, but his legacy continued to live on. She gently touched his name etched in stone, whispering, I did it, my son. In that moment, she could almost see Jamal standing there, smiling like he did so many years ago. Late in the afternoon, Kesha sat on a bench in the park, watching the children run and play, their laughter filling the air. The gentle breeze swept through her hair, bringing a warmth that felt like an embrace from afar. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the peace she never thought she would find. Justice couldn't erase the pain. It couldn't bring Jamal back, but it gave her the strength to keep living, to stand up, to fight, and to make this world a better place for Jaden and for all the children like her son. In the distance, the camera panned slowly, capturing the image of the children laughing and playing in the park. The last rays of sunset bathed the space in a warm, golden hue. Kesha's battle had ended, but the legacy of Jamal, and of her, would live on forever. As this story comes to an end, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this emotional journey. Kesha's fight for justice was not just her own. It was a reflection of the struggles so many face in the real world. It was a story of loss, resilience, and ultimately, hope. Justice may not erase the pain, but it gives us the strength to move forward, to fight for what is right, and to make sure no one else has to endure the same suffering. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think, feel, or even question the world around you, I encourage you to share it. Let's spread awareness, let's start conversations, and let's stand together against injustice. And if you want to see more powerful, thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Journey. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that challenges perspectives and sheds light on the untold struggles of so many. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for believing in the power of storytelling. See you in the next story.